Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for making it here so early this morning to join our morning forum. Let me first tell you that we are very fortunate to have Dr. Yukiko Fukagawa as our guest speaker this morning. And in a way, she is a very special person to us too. But I said we are very fortunate because I find it's rather not easy to find a well-qualified speaker from Japan. As a matter of fact, I asked to Dr. Sagong to recommend me one, and he came up with Dr. Fukagawa's name, and I appreciate that. And I said she is a very special person to us because she is one of the very few economists who knows both economies, Japan and Korea, at the same time. Well, today she's going to give us a talk on the recent economic performance of Korea and Japan, focusing on what we can learn possibly from each other's experiences, regardless whether they are good or bad. As you know, Japan has been the world-leading economy and has been virtually only one advanced economy in Asia, while Korea remains still at a stage of economic development. But as you see, for the past couple of decades, Japanese economy didn't do very well. And the Korean economy did a little bit better, but not that much better. So I think it is a very opportune time to make a review on both economies in a comparative framework and identify some of the important policy issues and challenges that both economies may face in the coming years. Well, I don't think I need to spend much time to tell you who Dr. Fukagawa is, because you probably already are very familiar with her name through the Korean news media. She has been writing pretty good articles in Korean newspapers. I read the latest one just a week ago in Chosunilbo. Well, she is currently a professor of economics at Waseda University, teaching economic development and Asia studies since 2006. Before she joined Waseda University, she taught Korea studies at the University of Tokyo and Aoyama Gakuin University in Japan between 1998 and 2006. Before that, she worked with the long-term Cap Credit Bank of Japan, which does not exist anymore at the moment, I think. And she worked with JETRO, which I heard a kind of equivalent of KOTRA in Korea. I don't know, is that correct? KOTRA? As a senior economist there, during the 1980s and 90s, and I realized that he speaks very fluent Korean this morning, and no wonder she spent a year visiting one Korean research institute named KIET in 1989, just to study on the Korean economy. And I also heard from Dr. Oh Yoon-dae from Korea University that she visited Korea University too. It's too bad I didn't meet her when I was there. I spent there almost 30 years, but she worked somewhere else, I think. Well, now let me present Dr. Fukagawa to you for her speech. Will you speak here or there? Dr. Fukagawa? You will speak here, right? Okay. Please give her a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Of course, I'm very much happy to be able to come back to this place again. I think I've already given a talk about 3-4 times for the IGE, and every time the one thing that I really appreciate is that I can see very familiar faces. Because IG's guest is always full of the big stars about the Korean economy. So this is also my very good opportunity for me is to upgrade the networking, human networks in Korea. Since we are running out of time, I've just tried to go straight to my presentation. But actually, I would like to ask you for your generosity because now we are at the beginning of the semester on campus, and everything is really crazily pressed. And we are hosting the delegations from Korea University. And of course, between Waseda and Koryo, whenever we meet each other, we are supposed to drink a lot. And then we had a go-go and Waseda type of toast 2 nights. And I was so much exhausted when I tried to prepare this PowerPoint. So there's some Japanese appeared in the statistics. Okay, so today's my topic is an economic performance of Japan and Korea in globalization and its backlash. And my basic conclusions here is that at least Korea seems to be doing much better in the backlash because of the very structural reasons. And now we are having a kind of small booms, a kind of fresh, with some fresh feeling that let's benchmark Korean performance. So this is a very historically new kind of trend, but actually one time I wrote in the Korean newspaper saying that in the meantime, I'm pretty much sure that the time will come that Japan will have to focus on Korean performance in a global system. And now what we are seeing seems to be very much expected beforehand. And the outline is like this. I would like to point out 3 realities in globalizations, which sometimes to be very much ignored by many emotional or political or social reasons. One is the growing structures has changed a lot, drastically. And the second issue is since the global economies is very much changed already, the patterns or the strategies of economic growth or industrializations seems to have changed a lot, especially for Japan and Korea, since we are the first generations of industrializations in Asia. When we are growing, we are pretty much based on the GATT type of foundations instead of WTO. So the third thing is that, we've been working on Japan-Korean FTA, which has never been successful at all. But the reality is that Japan and Korean markets are already pretty much merged. So the FTA talk is just to institutionalize, just to confirm that the market is integrated. And so this is a 3 reality that is very much different if even compared before the so-called Lehman Brothers crisis. And secondly, I would like to talk about the impact of globalization backlash, comparing between Japan and Korea, and that is the major topic. And finally, I would try to withdraw some implications from my logic. And so the post-crisis global economy that we are living now, still there are many uncertainties in mature economies. Well, the market sentiment right now is very optimistic. Well, it's quite natural that the whole world has been spending so much to boost the economy. So now, of course, some rapid recovery was very much expected, but still we have lots of discussion about how to exit from the situations by having some sort of soft landing, especially for Japan and U.S. because our budgetary deficit is so huge. And also we still have some European Union crisis starting from Greece. And then many people say, or maybe BRICS, like China, Russia, or India, and those emerging economies, they are to move the global economies. But they are, if we just look their structures closely, still they have some fragile foundations, and especially they are fragile in terms of financial sector, and the swinging liquidity, sometimes extreme shortage of the credit, and sometimes the too much credit. This is a very much kind of difficult situations that they have to deal with. And so, of course, again, in closely related to exit issues, we have big issues between mainly the U.S. and China in terms of the rebalancing their very much distorted, imbalanced structures. And also, financial crisis seems to be somewhat managed this time, but still the adjustment speed by the real economies like manufacturing and services, they are very slow. And in that sense, still we have a lot of risk, especially for the rise of the protectionism. And if we are to depend upon solely on the big energy-consuming emerging powers for the further sustainabilities of global economies, there's absolutely some resource sustainabilities on a global basis. And since we are probably in a very historical change, but still the system to govern all the changes is very much uncertain. WTO is very stagnant. COP15 for environment issues very much failed, and G20, I think one of the big issues for in these countries is now G20, but whether G20 is good enough to substitute the so-called G7 is still we don't know. So we are in a very in a world of uncertainty, big uncertainty. If you look at, I think this is a Japanese, but most of you may read a Chinese character, but this only shows that how the budgetary deficit of U.S. and on the left-hand side and top, and the Japan on the left side bottom, this is quite similar, about more than 10% of GDP, which is very serious. And England is also even more serious than us. And then Germany is getting much better, but still all the mature economies are suffering from the huge budgetary deficit, and also and they are very much suffering from the unemployment rate. So basically, U.S. was only the country, almost the only country, who's recording the huge current account deficit, and Asia was financing it. And then now we have a different flow of the capital. It was more from the U.S. to Asia Pacific. That's the orange colors is the capital flow from U.S. to Asia Pacific, and it has been increasing after the present financial crisis. And then the money from Asia Pacific to U.S. has been declining. China has been very strategic, while Japan was in a slightly different positions, even though we are worried about the future of dollars, but still we are politically probably cannot really move against dollars, but China has different interests. So of course, even now, China's dollars is still so far has been maintaining the positions of key currencies, and China's even still continues to invest into U.S., but China may have another strategy. So. But the other thing is that since the credit came, all the money are coming back to Asia Pacific, especially the emerging market. China has been, as everybody knows, is very much sticking to maintaining the sustainabilities of Chinese yuan. But because of it, China had somewhat started to suffer the too much liquidity, and that has pushed up the property market. Sometimes the radical one with the dot is Sichuan, that is close to Hong Kong. I think this might be the most realistic trend, but the fluctuations is very deep, large after the financial shock. So we are in the process of rebalancing the imbalance globally, but if you see that still the U.S., the large pink ones at the bottoms is recording only quite a dominant recording the deficit, while the other countries are financing it, and the red one is China, and China has been emerging quite rapidly to finance the U.S. debt. So that's why the media always loves the ideas of G2. Okay, so I'll probably skip this. And mature economies has all the problems, and there's an expectations. Well, even this I just copied it from the IMF projections, but the growth is expected to be very much relied on the so-called emerging market, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, or even the Middle East. And usually the warm colors in these pictures is emerging market. So before the crisis, they are only contributing 30% of the global economy growth, but now more than 50% of the growth is very much pushed by the relatively large economies among the emerging market. So anyway, the growth structures of emerging market is very much important, and this is very crucial factors in comparing the performance between Japan and Korea, actually, because I think many Japanese have already started to realize it, but the Korean firms, especially the so-called leading firms like a Big Four or Big Five, they are responding quite well to the emerging market because of the various reasons. And structures of emerging big, not the small open economies, but the big economies with a big population in precise way, like China or India, they have some very unique characters if we are to analyze as a market. So first one is a mass consumption. And they are very different from Japan, Korea, domestic market, which is very much homogeneous. And since they are big, first of all, and they are very much a kind of children of globalizations, so that the market demand is very much varied from old economies to new economies. They still need a lot of infrastructure, very simple kind of consumer goods, but they also need a very sophisticated service and anything. So they need us from low-tech to high-tech products, and from goods to services. And also, how they are sustained their income consistently. The growing patterns is very much different from Japan and Korean times. They are very much benefited by the global fragmentations and agglomeration process of the industries. So there are sometimes, even Korean media, sometimes I feel that still peoples are try to think about the economies by national basis, in the national advantage, comparative advantage, or these kind of things like a Heckscher-Ohlin type of ideas that we all learned at the beginning of the economics in campus. But now what we are seeing is very different in their structures, so that sometimes the regions can be very much successful by attracting foreign direct investment and having some huge industrial agglomeration. So it's nothing to do with some very basic things, especially measured by average GDPs or something. So it's more regions than nation. That means a lot. And so if you see the market is very unique. It's not a typical in a textbook. So the market segmentations is very much unique. So first is populations is basically expanding. So still demographically, it is a very young market, especially in India and Brazil. And urbanizations is another recent phenomena of globalizations. So urbanization speed is very, very rapid. So if you look at China's economies is very much dominated by big city and the economic blocks surrounding the cities. And people continues to move from their local areas to the cities. But what's good things about the cities is all their service functions are concentrated in the cities. So even the poor guys who are coming from the local areas, but the income that they can spend on goods and service can be sometimes much more than they look. Of course, if they are living in a city, they are offered by many, in sometimes, they are benefited by the relatively sophisticated financial services, so that they can depend upon the some borrowings, and also their demand for goods is very much stimulated by sophisticated marketing and advertisement. So that's a feature. And also digitalization. I don't think I have to explain about this, because Korea is quite an IT-based society already. And the emerging market consumers are so much benefited by that. And their information base is pretty much based on the internet and the mobile phone instead of the TV in our times. So that they know quite a lot about the fashionable products. So that's why they try to consume the most fashionable, most high-ended product if they can afford. But even the poor guys try to follow it. So the growth structures emerging markets are very different from our times. So we've seen a lot of rising new consumers. The consumers are very diverse. And since they are relatively big countries, the basic foundations for the consumers are very different. Like infrastructure is different, geography matters, and family size are very different, and lifestyles are whole different, because China's and India's, Brazil's is somewhat more homogeneous, but India's is quite varied in terms of the society. And they are independent of each other in terms of state, unlike China. So their consumers are very varied. And also there's a class segmentation because of the income gap. This is extremely larger than our times. So that segmentation is quite important in marketing the big emerging market. And information is globalized already, and consumers are more responding towards their manufacturers through the mobile phone, blog, and Twitters recently. So the economies is very different from the past, like economy of scale, because they are big, but also the scope is also very much important. And also they are always very much demanding, so their cost performance is very crucial factor to fit into the emerging big economies with such as some kind of hybrid technologies, well, high technologies, but still with a relatively good price. And the customer satisfaction is very important because they are responding because of the these IT type of consumers. So the reasons why I was stressing these kind of things is that Korean firms seems to be fitted into these customers much better than the Japanese firms. So they are very much segmented, and also they are very much well managed in terms of the marketing and especially managing their brand images, and also customer satisfaction. I think sometimes Korean firms can be very much benefited by the painful experience of the so-called IMF crisis, because you have to satisfy the consumers, otherwise you have to get out from the market. So this very basic and simple principle was so much learned by Korean firms, while the Japanese firms have never had this sort of painful experiences. And we've been so much dependent upon the domestic market because, well, simply because the Japanese market used to be the number 2 largest market. So we didn't pay so much attention to the global market, and that's the weakness of the Japanese firms. So that's why we could not catch up with the Korean firms in terms of the acquiring the market share in growing, large, emerging market. So that's one thing. And second thing is is more fundamental one. Industrialization model has been changing so fast. So we talked about the comparative advantage in many times, and still probably some patriotic Korean media are always criticizing the trade deficit against Japan, saying that, well, to me, their ideas still seems to be very much bounded by the nation kind of framework. But now it's not the nations, but it's the industrial networks across the borders and accumulations that is going to decide the competitiveness. And it's the nation as a whole sometimes does not mean a lot. So if we look at the East Asian growth model, we see many different features, especially in terms of their institutions. So the models, first generations, of course, between what is just like Japan, Korea, Taiwan type of development, and we are pretty much based on the so-called nation states and national economy, and we are trying to build it up, and that's why local entrepreneurship is very much stressed. So that's why we had a lot of government interventions through the so-called industrial policies, and skill building is quite an important issue in terms of technologies. And to back up, to support the long-term skill building, we needed the relatively long-term capital, the industrial capital, I should say, through banking. So this is our first generation patterns. And then the second generation came with the ASEAN leading 4 countries, probably like Thailand or Malaysia. They are not really sticking to the local entrepreneurs purely, and they try to attract the foreign direct investment quite intensively. But the local entrepreneurs, since they have certain advantage including their political vested interest, they could concentrate more on the resource-based businesses, and by nature, since they are quite dominated by the Chinese capitalists, their capitals tends to be more for their trade and the commercial capital. And then there came the third generation, finally, like China or India and Brazil. And they are very different even from the second generations, because in their times, the global economies is so much integrated already. So in their model, there's no distinction between the outward and inward FDI. If you see that in our times, usually the developing countries try to attract an FDI, or maybe by try to nurture the local entrepreneurship, and then if you can be competitive enough, and then you are supposed to open the market and try to go abroad, try to invest abroad. But now what we are seeing is they are doing both at the same time. So we're seeing is all active M&A activities by Chinese firms, because they accumulate such a huge foreign reserves, while still Chinese economies is very much dependent on the foreign direct investment. So, and recently Chinese government has interestingly tried to be seems to be more interested in the so-called industrial policies in the past, saying that, oh, hey, we accepted so much FDI, but now how much our economies is dependent on foreign multinationals, it's strange. So let's push up the local firms. So this is a opposite development between the first generations and the third generation. So, and also another thing is since things are quite globalized, the movement of natural persons, as well as all the infrastructures, including ITs, allow them to realize this very different type of economic development. So the finance is very much globalized already. So they don't really have to support their local entrepreneurship by our own savings like the first generation. So the third generation industrialization is very different from first, even from the second. So the factors deciding the competitiveness is very much changed. In ancient times, we are all told that developing countries should do this and this and this so that they can prepare the sustainable growth. But now, maybe infrastructure or cheap and good quality labors, etc. But now, what is most important is how to borrow or how to coordinate the FDIs and other outside managerial resources, and that capacity is decisively important. And the second thing is the decision-making speed. Since speed is so much crucial in the globalized economies, because everybody is competing each other, so that's another thing. And also, diversity management is so much crucial because there's so many different talented people coming from the different countries. So how to manage the diversities is a very crucial, important factors. And also, risk is already important. It is always there because, well, even though that we say that global economies is pretty much merged, but still we have different countries, different people, different government. So the risk is always there, and it's getting sometimes, if mismanaged, the risk is very huge on the developing economies. So now we probably need some new type of government, private sector relationship to get on well with the global changes. So that's why I say new corporations like Korea corporations or Japan corporations are very much needed. So just looking from these factors, again, I can say that Korea is performing better than Japan at least, because they, again, through the painful IMF crisis, they realized that the global economy has changed a lot. So, and also, decision-making speed is at least much faster here, thanks to the owner type of big firms. That is very much in contrast from Japan. Well, semiconductors or maybe mobile phone, all the leadership taken by Samsung is very much known as a result of the leadership of probably Chairman Igoni. But when we are in an IMF crisis, they are very much criticized that family business ruined the national economies or this kind of thing. But now you're benefited by the structures, and the Japanese companies who are very much separated between the ownership and the managers, they cannot catch up probably with as they remain as they are. I think it should be very difficult to catch up in terms of speed and decision making and the taking the responsibility of the decisions, because it's a huge organizations of the bureaucrats and they never try to take any responsibility. So serious decisions is always up in the air, and that's why they are slow in everything. And the second thing is diversity management. One of the crucial, very big problems about Japan is a so-called, I say, number 2 economy syndrome. Still many people, well, if you are inside Japan, you never feel that you are failing, you're just lagging behind the globalized economy, because still it seems to be huge. And unfortunately, Japan has always been recording a current account surplus. There's no IMF on Japan. So in that case, you never realize that world is very much diversified at the same time, so you have to adapt into the situations in managing the diversities, especially in terms of the human capital. So it's interesting. It's very interesting that Korean firms, no matter how have some difficult times with the labor union inside Korea, but outside Korea, relatively Korean firms are doing much better because they. Well, first, technically, the managers at least are much better in English or other foreign language communication if compared with the Japanese managers, and they decided to accept the diversity world by scouting so many global talents from all over the world. So in terms of the human capital, I think Samsung is far globalized companies than the major Japanese firms like Sony or Toshiba or whatever. And that's why they can be naturally adapting to the growth structures. And also Korean government, I know there are still many familiar old type of Korean ink, but still the way or the behavior of Korean ink has been far sophisticated than before. And now, wherever you go, especially when you try to sell your power generation plant or probably in a Shinkansen or bullet train in the future, you have to negotiate with the government. And of course, the top sales by the politicians are quite important. And Korea is very much benefited by the presidential system. And thanks to the president, who is an experienced businessman, probably, and he seems to be quite aggressive about this. And Japan cannot catch up with these structures again. So that's the major, very fundamental structural reasons why Japan is lagging behind Korea in the changing global economies. So, but the situation and also the situations of Japan and Korean economies is very different each other, even though we are we share some very common foundations. And for Japan, in one word, the global crisis started with the real economy rather than the financial sector. Of course, still, Japan is the largest capital exporters to the global economy because China is still controlling the foreign exchange and capital export. So that the first shock came after the Lehman Brothers came with in Japanese financial sectors by deteriorating the overseas asset. Of course, we invested to everything. So, but domestically, we appreciate, many people were probably too much optimistic about Japan because all the non-performing loans are solved in Japan already. That is very different from the US and even the European countries because our so-called lost 15 years was all gone with the Koizumi times. So we seems to be pretty much in good shape, especially in banking. So many people thought Japan would be still much better than Europe or US. So that's why yen has been very much appreciated because yen was the almost only relatively risk-free international currency. So, we are very much suffering from the real sector because of the yen appreciation. And the real sector started to suffer from the enormously rapid historical export fall from mature market. And the Japanese leading firms' response towards the catching up with the Korean firms is like this. Oh, our yen is very much appreciated, and Koreans and Chinese firms are all catching up. So let's invest into the R&D sector and try to go into the high-end, technology-intensive sector as much as possible. And then the market tends to be the mature market, and that was the expectations by Japanese managers. Since our product is still very much expensive, probably the potential market should be only in the U.S. or Europe, especially U.S. And that's why Japanese economy is so much dependent on the bubble economies or bubble consumers in the U.S. And that is the one of the big failures about Toyota, as I think Toyota's failures is so much reported in this country, but that was the reasons why Toyota enormously accelerated their productions in the U.S., and that's the reasons why they ended up in responding so late to the change of the market. So that's one thing. And also another thing that Korea did not suffer a lot, but Japan did suffer a lot, was that still we are providing a lot of crucial intermediate goods like machinery or crucial parts to Korea or China or many Asian countries. So in Korean case, if the final goods demands for the final goods decreases quite rapidly, then you can just adjust the inventory by cutting out all the import. But Japan is both exporting the final goods, super sophisticated goods to the mature market, but also providing the intermediate goods to major Asian countries. And both sides of exports are pressured. So Japan was almost the final anchors for the shrinkage of all the demands. So that's why real sector suffered so much. And the another issues that is not so much that is very different from Korea was the consumption falls very rapidly again, and we started to suffer the so-called deflationary spiral. So Japanese export dependency is about 1/4 of the Korean economy. So we are pretty much dependent on the domestic market, and the huge domestic market is continues to shrink. Of course, that is going to pressure the Japanese firms' profit, and also in terms of employment, this time Japanese major firms have been radically adjusting the employment, almost like the situations in the Korean's IMF crisis. So that is another reason why the consumption never picks up, because people fear about the unemployment and also about the after the retirement life. And also, finally, we have a big change in the politics. And Japanese political change is almost after 55 years. So it's almost like a crash of the Soviet Union. So that all the decision-making process in the government is very chaotic even now, because the LDP system was so much established, and we are still in a probing way to get out from the exit, but no one knows the directions. So the crisis is very much deeply rooted in Japan. And in Korea, in my observations, Korea suffers, Korea is almost destined to suffer from the really roaring coaster type of the financial crisis. But partly this time was very much shocked by the at the beginning of the financial crisis, global financial crisis. The crisis started from the currency again, because many people worried about the expanded property investment in Korea. That is very much related to it's very much reported as if related like on subprime loans in the U.S. And also another institutions was the presence of the foreign banks and investors. And since the global capital is so much big, in contrast with the domestic financial asset, Korea have to be very much influenced by massive inflow and outflow of the capital after the regime change. For the so that the crisis seems to come from mainly from the financial sector, not in the real sector. In the real sector, of course, energy efficiencies in Korea is much worse than Japan still. So energy and resource hike always pressures the Korean economies. And also Korea suffered a lot with the export falls, but it has recovered quite rapidly thanks to the swift response towards the emerging market. And the dark side is probably the large firms, the so-called globalized firms, they are doing fine. But the small firms with the fragile financial foundation, their futures is very fragile, seems to be fragile. And this time, but thanks to the adjustment, massive adjustment about a decade ago, the impact on the employment seems to be quite minor in Korea if compared to Japan. And but also the labor market has been very much stagnant. I mean, they tried to improve the flexibilities, but so far the employment, the growth without employment has been the feature of Korean economies after the first financial crisis a decade ago. That is the main reasons why the impact on employment seems to be minor. And the government was always been desperate to support the economy, so that the rising government debt in facing the aging societies has started to be a big pressure on the Korean economy. So I just skipped upon some data part, but I just wanted to show that those features that, well, just maybe in Japan's case, Japan's growth was slower. If we've been just, even the Japanese economies have been picking up, but still the speed is very slow if compared to Korea. And the more important thing is the deflationary pressures is very much related with the unemployment and consumers' attitudes and deflations again. And but Korea is getting much better, much faster than Japan, and property market is still never crashed in this country, and the consumption recovers in response to the export. So if we just compare the Japan and Korea's in global change, there should be a crucial difference. as explained already, market strategies by firms, or even, in one sense, the difference between Japan and Korea is that Korea is committed that we have to go with the global economies. But Japan is still very much plagued with the ideas of number two economies, and we are still big. And so that's why the government has never been so serious about an FTA, and the firms are so much sticking to the domestic market, even though we are suffering from the shrinkage of the productions for 2 decades. So Japan is not ready for the globalization. So what happened after the crisis was that Japanese yen was nominally appreciated, and that's why the firms are rushed into a more R&D drive and high value-added goods and high-end markets into the mature economies, and that was hit hardly. And Korea was different. Won was rather depreciated, and there was an export drive, disparate export drive to emerging market. So that's a major difference of the performances. And also, even the government is so much committed to make the middle power in a global society. Well, still Japan seems to try to believe in that still they're big. So we are not so much serious about the FTA or some other integration strategies, while Korea was leading in this field. And international financial order, well, even though Japan has the largest financial asset, but still we are only the follower in decision in architecting the global financial order. I don't know why they don't have such a strong opinions, but still we just remain to be calm and pretty much responsive. And Korea at least tries to chair the G20 so that you can represent the voices of the small open economies. So the government seems to be much more aggressive than Japan at least. And energy and resource sustainability, well, Japan has always been praised as the most energy efficient, the country with the highest technologies for resource saving productions. But sometimes we criticize ourselves that it is just like a difference between Kim Yona and Asada Mao. Kim Yona's models is a globalized model. She was trained in Canada. Her performance is pretty much fit into the newly established rule, and that's why, not by taking too much risk, she could perform much better than Asada Mao. And Asada Mao is a very different characters, and she learned. Her coach was in Russian, and Russian model is getting getting old actually. And that's why Asada Mao was so much sticking to the real triple axel, kind of very difficult jump and performances, and that is very risky. But she still think that this is the things that you have to challenge as an athlete. I'm not the ballet player, so as an athlete, I should do that, and that is the only way to get the gold medals. But the purpose of the athlete is in the Olympic Games is to get the gold medals, not the just challenge the most difficult performance. So that's just like a Japanese companies. Japanese companies are sticking so much to the technologies, and since most of the Japanese managers are from the engineers, not the financial or some other business guys. So they're so much concentrated on the technologies, and they're taking such a huge risk by spending so much money on basic R&D technologies. So the Korean firms' models is just like Kim Yona type of models. They don't really spend so much on R&D, so basic technologies. That's the things that can be expected from the Japanese companies. You don't really have to worry about it. And then once the technology seems to have a huge market potentially, you just rushed into the productions with such a large scale, and then Korean companies is going to make such a huge profit. So that is the relationship between Japan and Korea now. So we are quite worried about even though the environment technology seems to be quite a prominent resource for Japanese growth, but we are somewhat quite worried about the too much dependencies on the so-called high tech. And Korea's is a market strategies with a very clear market strategies with the middle technologies, and that seems to be far more feasible than the Japanese firms. So this shows, the rapid recoveries of Korean economies is very obviously supported by the massive spending by the government. This shows the fiscal spending on for economic stimulus, and Korea was almost the number 2 economies, only after Russia, in pushing up in terms of the degree of the government spending to push up the economies. And Japan is far, far below, like in the U.S., like a 2% of the GDPs or something. And the rooms for policy rate cuts, interest rate cuts for major countries. Japan was the lowest because the interest rate was almost 0, so there was no rooms for Japan to cut the interest rate. So Korea was even much better in this point. And but still, Japan is believing that we are such a big powers, and that is very much serious things about Japan. And this compares the Japan and Korea, how many FTA that is already negotiated or even signed. And Korean's export is going to be pretty much covered by FTA. In the meantime, if only you can ratify the major pact, and if successfully done the deal with Japan and Korea, almost 70-80% of whole Korean export will be covered by free trade agreement. And I think this is quite a right directions for Korean economies to go. But Japan is very slow. The reason why it's very clear that agricultural sector is such a political vested interest for LDP. And even the newly emerged Democratic Party, still they are screaming about the vested interest for agriculture sector. So without that, Japan can never be able to catch up with the Korean speed in agricultural sector liberalization. And also, as I said, Korea is at least is making such a big efforts to catch up with the third generation type of industrialization in the present time. And Japan seems to remain quite so much based on the first generation model. And illusions for the technology powers is so much heavy on Japanese policymakers. And but on the other hand, Korean side sometimes is very much shadowed by probably influenced by Japan, but trade deficit problems is is still binding the major Japanese Korean newspapers as well as the policymakers. So still many people believe in that Korea is to catch up with Japan, and that is the reasons why the trade deficit against Japan should be solved. So I think this is a wrong, very distorted, out of date structures or illusions between us. And another thing is, I say that Korean firms, especially the leading firms, is very much performing better than segmenting and concentration of the resources with clear priority. And that is, again, just a very big difference between Japan and Korea. And Baramakis is a scattering around anything to everybody's. Baramakis is already English because of Japan, but the Baramakis is, we cannot get out from this Baramaki situations from the government to the major leading firms. So that, structurally, it is very difficult for Japan to just cut out something and concentrate on something, and that's why the speed is very slow and the result is never clear. And as I said, Korean major firms are benefited by super speedy decision-making process, probably by family business structures. and also probably experienced by the IMF crisis. And the global management is much in terms of the commitment towards the global economies, Korea is leading Japan. So that if you see that in major emerging market, this shows the TVs and projections in Brazil and India, and the light blue one shows the Korean market share, and Japan has almost disappeared except the Toshiba operating in Brazil, because Toshiba's TVs is the first generations of Brazilian new broadcasting, and it was only doing slightly better because of the broadcasting system. So that this shows the productivities of Samsung and LG in the blue lines, and the yellow lines shows the Sony plus other 8 Japanese electronic manufacturing firms. And the Japanese productivity is very flat, but Koreans is just risen quite rapidly after 1996. So that is the reasons why you can grasp all the big shares like DRAM 60, almost the market share of Korean major manufacturing goods like DRAM, semiconductor, mobile phone, TVs. The global market share almost double in last year if compared to only 2005, and this was quite a successful cases. So. And that is the major reasons why we are so different each other. But finally, I would like to add that, the Japan and Korea market is very much integrated already in some sense. Even though Korean firms are leading far better than the Japanese old and big firms, but the macro economic structures between Japan and Korea has not changed a lot. Still, Japan is providing a lot of capitals and intermediate goods for Korean exporters, and many people criticize it. But I think that is the reasons why Korean leading firms could gain such a huge profit, because they don't invest such a unproductive sectors. And Japan cannot stop it because of the baramakis and because of the more probably harmonious societies or something. So the structures is very different in the past, but at least because when the Korean firms are performing much poorer than the Japanese firms, you could claim that we haven't completed our catch-up yet. So that's why our companies are less competitive than the Japanese firms, but now you're leading. So I don't think you have any rationale saying that, Japan is still dominating. So that is, the situation has changed a lot. But another change factor that we have to seriously think about is, after the regime change, the Korean economies, the performance of Korean economies has been very much vulnerable, has started to be very much vulnerable to the fluctuations of currencies. So you have to be serious about how to stabilize the exchange, even though it is not an easy challenges. And in terms of employment, definitely we have to make more efforts to upgrading the productivities of the service sector instead of the manufacturing sector, because they are already globalized anyway. And that is the only room, the industries that have rooms to upgrade the productivity, so that we can depend upon more employment, more job creations like tourism, culture, education, finance, logistics, and this kind of things. And in these service industries, geography means a lot, because we are the eternal neighbor, and a movement of natural persons is easiest between us, as the successful case between Kimpo, Haneda shuttles already shown, so that better deregulations, coordinated deregulations, is going to create the great regional market. If Japan and Korea are integrated, it is quite a large market for service industries. It's a very homogeneous market. And local-to-local interface is another very important factors. More Japanese major local airports are now supported by either Asiana or Korean Air after the Japan Airlines. So the market is pretty much integrated. So my conclusion is Korea outperforms Japan for several reasons. First reasons is a better competitiveness in emerging market and globalization model. And there's, in some sense, a seesaw kind of game between Japan and Korea now. And Japan is scattered around all the precious managerial resources into R&D without any good prudent analysis, and maybe taking too much risk. And again, since it doesn't produce any profit, the smaller, even the budget, firm's budget gets smaller and smaller for the marketing, and then sales trying to shrink, and then we need a more restructuring, and maybe we are providing very excellent, talented people, probably to the whole world, but especially for Korea because industrial structure is quite similar. So I noticed that Samsung has been very much supported by Japanese firms and Japanese engineers. After they're fired, they are scouted by Samsung, and they provided very good information about how to compete with the Japanese firms, actually. So Korea is the opposite. Product development is very much based on the almost customer fundamentalism kind of attitudes, and intensive marketing and advertisement has been very much successful in emerging market, and Korean firms are always, even sometimes venturously decisive about massive production, and then profit gains, and then you can get better patent, better human resource. So that is the formula that you could win. So in these terms, Japan, in the seesaw game, Japan and Korean markets are quite, in my sense, integrated already. And Japan's small medium firms were specialized into the intermediate goods in very high quality, but it's very cheap price, I think is contributing Koreans' great success, especially in terms of the global firms. And still we had different priorities. As long as the structures goes like this, I think Korean growth foundations is very much established with the failure by the failure of the Japanese response. And still Japan's is easygoing about economic power paradigm, and FTA negotiations tends to be very slow, and anti-globalization emotions is very much pushing the vested political interest of the politicians. We are going to have an election this summer, so well, I'm very pessimistic about the Japanese response about the globalizations, and the Koreans is totally opposite. And of course, you screamed about the globalizations, especially in the Nomhyun regime, but now Koreans the political cycle seems to be very different, at least from Japan. So, and also, after all, Korea's political vested interest in the domestic market is much smaller, less established if compared to Japan, except the property business. So that, and also the market is fortunately not too large like in Japan. So Japan is absolutely more consistent, comprehensive, globalization strategies and more pressures for the sense of urgencies. And Korea needs probably a risk-averse benchmarking target, and Japan cannot be cannot be reliable anymore like in the past. And you have to stand on your own feet by taking some more risk, because after all, if you don't really invest into your original product, just following all the somebody else inventions, well, the image will not be established really, perfectly. So, and also Korea needs an anchoring market, institutional mechanism against globalizations, and if just standalone, Korea is not too large, so that you need better anchoring market for the stabilities. So we can actually have a good combinations of interest between Japan and Korea. New partnership and deep market integrations seems to be quite good rationale. Starting from the finance standardizations on a mutual recognition agreement for human capital, because we are quite challenging common agendas of aging society. And since the model has been changed, the industrial accumulations is quite important. And from Kyushu to Busan or Ulsan areas, the accumulations of automobile industries is the greatest in both depth and scales in biggest in the world. So if we cooperate each other, I think the accumulation effect will is going to be quite effective enough. And probably we have to change our values for more productivity-based growth and job creation effect, because we are threatened by the global competition anyway. So that strategies should be optimizing the commonalities, and we just should go back to the rationales or the powers of geography, because we are the eternal neighbor. So the conclusion is, today's talk is that there are three realities that we really look seriously. One is the world is multipolarizing world with the emerging market. We have to adapt into these realities, and the growth model has been changed totally. And there is, in some sense, Japan-Korea seesaw games, and the markets are quite integrated already, good enough. So Korea outperforms Japan because of number one and number two structures, and it's especially based on the win-win seesaw game in number three. And so in that sense, Japan-Korea integration should be revised from the common agenda, like service or environment and logistics or these kind of things, for our as strategies of new growth strategies. So the crucial framework to start with, Japan should realize that we are not the number two economy anymore. And Korea should start from the recognitions that certain regionalism is necessary to complement the globalism if you are serious to get out from the growth without employment. Thank you very much, and I believe I have sometimes to pick up some questions if you have it.
Kimura and Asad Mao. Very, very interesting example. The Kimura became a gold medalist in Olympic, but she came down to 17 world champion. Why? I played formerly a very good golfer. If you have albatross or bogey, then the colleague said, nice shot, wonderful, they praised so much. And the second round, maybe hit double par or triple bogey. That happened in Kimura and Ahadamo's case. you made a very good comments and highly appreciate Korean economy, 3 to 4 points. But like Chairman Igoni, I afraid very much Korea boasted themselves and become the ITs and leading industry will dwindle down next few years or 1 decade. That is my first comment. And second comment is, you are right. Korea is made a structural change at IMF. IMF made about 12 agreements to Korean governments, out of which about 7 agreements made for the corporate governance. And forward-looking criteria, FOLC, which is made by IBRD. So I went down to Japan. I gave Professor Fukagawa the Japanese copy. We made a seminar July 1997 in a Japanese press center, and I advised to make forward-looking criteria of the bad debt loan. But Ushijima, number 2 man of Japanese Cabinet Economic Institute, reluctantly said that's not fit in a Japanese system, the forward-looking criteria. But Japan passed a law, we don't pass the law, we made according Constitution Article 7, the agreement and ratified by the National Assembly will become no effect. That is the case in Japan and Korea. One short, very easy question is, what is baramaki means? That is a scattering out or disbursement?
I quite agree with your comments that, well, there's no outside pressure, unfortunately, about Japan. And, well, of course, IMF was made lots of wrong decisions about the Korean economy in the present judgment. If the U.S. was in the same situations, nobody in the IMF probably would dare to exactly copy their prescriptions. But it was only at that time U.S. Financial power was almost at the peak, and they could do that. But the basic things is quite true that you need somebody from outside, so that you have to do something painful. But Japan was very much unfortunate in that case. But I think the time will come in the meantime, because the budgetary situation is so serious, and politicians even now they're only concerned about the coming elections only in this summer. It's a super myopia of their. They need a huge class to adjust their sight, I believe. But well, so let's see what will happen in Japan.
Okay.
You did not mention one aspect of the global economy, which is agriculture. So, economy, for me, I'm not economist. I'm just a simple man. And economy comes from eikos in Greek, that means house. So, in the house, you have to eat. And I cannot understand how you can discuss the world economy without eating. Of course, we are eating a lot here, but you're just talking about competitiveness, about making advanced things, and what people are going to eat. the population is growing, and the food is not growing. I'm not Malthusian now, but I'm worried about that because, and then you talk about protectionism in Asia, Japan and Korea talk about, oh, we cannot accept protectionism, but they want to sell everything, TV and cell phones and computers, but they are very protectionist about food. They do not want to import food, they do not want to import rice, they don't want to import beef. So I think the economics nowadays is a little bit distorted because the theories, the capital labor market, is something of the 18th century. You know, this is very, very, very old. If you're talking about globalization, you have to think everything. So, you know, tomorrow you cannot eat microchips. You have to eat corn. You have to eat wheat. You have to eat soybeans. So that's what I really would like to know. You know, I suppose most people here are all from industry. There's nobody from agriculture here. So what are we talking about? We're talking about competitivism and everything, but we are forgetting the fundamental. We have to eat, we have to drink. Water will be lacking in the future. And all the water and food are in the third world. You know, so you cannot sell. You're talking about imbalance, but you cannot sell microchips and not to import food, because then that's how maybe civilization will destroy itself.
That the last thing that we give up anyway. So I think, well, in most Asian countries, well, even including China, we are resource poor countries. So, well, even in China's, in per capita basis, China's is a very resource poor country. So that's why we tend to ignore the importance of the agriculture, as you pointed out. But at the same time, because of that, we are very much concerned about the future of our food, naturally. And that's why many Korean firms, or of course the Japanese firms, have already invested heavily into Brazil or some agriculture-rich countries like Central Asian countries, including some former Soviet Union small countries. So we are pretty much worried. And one of the most fashionable business in recent years in Japan is the water business, because we are worried about the sustainability of water resources, especially in some major countries, because they are going so fast and they use up all the resources. And in that sense, water is the most precious thing that, because, well, so that's why many companies have invested into the environmental industries to change the sea waters into the pure waters and these kind of things. So in that way, I think we have enough rooms to cooperate with the big emerging market, having a relatively rich agricultural resources, to make our environment more sustainable, so that we can depend upon all the import from the direct import from major agricultural production countries, and also making the production structures itself is more sustainable. So, I think Japan is at least heading for that directions. We are pretty much criticized by the tuna fishing in the European countries, because even now China is eating the sushi, and they love tuna too. So maybe tuna will disappear. But recently, Japanese companies have founded the special cultivation technologies to produce tuna from the other kinds of common species of the fish. So the challenge for the R&D activities is endless, and still we try to be something more optimistic about the wisdom of the human being.
이건 오늘 주제와 직접 관계 없는 질문을 드리려고 하는데, 지금 하도야마 수상이 집권한 이래로 이제 친아시아, 어떤 의미에서 조금 반미적인 그런 정책을 하고 있는데, 그 원인이 어디 있느냐 하면 하도야마 수상의 할아버지가 수상을 했는데, 그 하도야마 할아버지 수상이 국회의원 때 2차 대전이 끝났다고 그래요. 그 당시 메가드 사령관한테 그 할아버지가 메가드 사령관은 젊음자다, 이런 칼럼을 썼다고 그걸 말했습니다. 그래서 메가드 사령관이 정치를 못하게 그 당시 국회의원을 했다는데, 그래서 정치적인 보복이라고 할까 그런 걸 당해서 요시다 수상 후에 이제 수상을 하게 됐는데, 그 본질적으로 좀 그 하도야마 수상 할아버지가 좀 반미적일 수밖에 없는, 그래서 지금 하도야마 수상도 그런 양을 좀 받았지 않느냐. 그래서 이번에 이제 도요타 그런 그 자동차 사건도 순수하게 경제적으로 볼 수 있겠지만 약간 그 정치적인 양도 있지 않느냐라고 보는 견해도 있는데, 거기에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지.
Hatoyama has its own personal history about his family, and it's a very interesting family history. But personally, absolutely, he's more committed to the. He's trying to be more to see the values more balanced between the U.S. and the rest of the rest of the world. And since Koizumi was so much sticking to the U.S. only, everything U.S. policies, rejecting the everything U.S. policies is one of the Hatoyama's attitudes, and that's why he provided some counter arguments that we are the part of Asia, so let's shake hands with the Asian communities and this kind of things. But Hatoyama at the same time is a very idealist. He's not a realist, actually, by his own characters. So his family translated a very famous book about the European integrations, so that he himself seems to be quite attracted by the ideals for European integration. Well, Europe without war, so this kind of things. But at the same time, I would like to point out that this is a kind of mood in Japan, even including the business society, that now all the mature market seems to be quite gloomy. So let's go back to the emerging market. Let's go back to Asia, where their growth is much higher. So even the business society seems to be somewhat supporting these ideas. And bureaucrats, of course, they are threatened, especially by the Korean probably counterparts, that they are leading all the FTA negotiation, and that's why the bureaucrats are even supporting these ideas. So the East Asian community ideas is a whole mixture of interest by business society, interest of the Hatoyama family, and bureaucrats' interest. So it's a very complicated kind of ideas. And in terms of Toyota, I think many Japanese have a feeling that Toyota is a kind of scapegoat for the deteriorating Japan-U.S. alliance. And U.S. politicians probably seems to be very much positive, aggressive, I should say, about playing up all their failures by Toyota. And actually Toyota did make such a huge mistake by responding so slow to the potential huge risk. But it's interesting the speed of the Toyota scandal has been very much accelerated with the irritations by the U.S. security lobbies. So now we have approaching to the deadline for the settling down of the so-called Okinawa U.S. space issues. So I think there's a kind of, it's not written or it's not proved, but still it seems to be a kind of synchronizing trend between the U.S.-Japan alliance and the Toyota issues. So Japanese lobby, the political lobby in the U.S. at this time stayed very calm about defending Toyota. So even though the U.S. crazy medias even invented wrong histories about inviting the strange persons that I was damaged by Toyota cars, etc. But sometimes lots of all the distorted reportings were all made in the U.S. and that was true, and no one tries to stop it. So I think political, the all chaotic chaos about the Japanese diplomacies has already started to shadow the business activities, and that is the reasons why Japan Inc. is totally incapable about dealing with anything.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Nam, for the floor, and thank you for organizing this lecture. I would like to follow up on Ambassador Fujita-san's question. Of course, many thanks to Professor Fukagawa for a brilliant lecture this morning. Very fascinating and very convincing comparison of Korea and Japan's economic engines. But it's primarily very much about the export-led growth, essentially. And as Fujita-san of Brazil pointed out, there are also other things like food. And of course, Professor Fukagawa has touched on services at the end of her lecture in her conclusion. I think, of course, it's too much for me to ask her, although I very much would like to hear her views on the potential challenges of Korea and Japan in their switch to the services sector. But perhaps that's the topic for another lecture, I think. I would just want to comment and perhaps solicit her views on extra economic factors affecting economic growth, just like food, It's in the house, but it's also outside the house. Because capitalism, in a sense, has certain dynamics, and I think Professor Fukagawa had very brilliantly analyzed it in the context of Korea and Japan. But there are also extra economic and perhaps extra capitalist sort of factors at work here. For example, the aging population in Japan and Korea and even China. In a sense, it's a constraint on growth because it affects the consumption and also production and retirement and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, I think there is also this political cycle that Professor Fukagawa also touched on. And I agree with her that Korea at this stage is doing better than Japan. And that's why the Korean thing seems to work better. But even though it works well, the political cycle is creating a political, it's creating an inflationary expectation of political performance, which I think makes it very difficult for developing countries, emerging markets, and even small developed markets, small countries that do not have debts. How do you manage that? Because the voters want satisfaction now. Never mind the long-term problems of fixing the pensions and saving for the future. Give me the cheap loans to buy my house now. So if Professor Fukagawa can sort of give us some comments on what I said, I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Specifically, your question is about the political, out of economy pressures or something. Yes, I think you're right, and especially, well, for probably Japanese and Korean point of view, Singapore, who's an English-speaking country, is a totally open economy. This should be, in some sense, it's a probably easiest going countries in the globalization because you have nothing to lose, and you can only expect gains coming from their globalization. But the rest of the other countries with certain size, but without any, well, Koreans is also leading in this aspect by crazily investing into English-speaking capability, while Japan still remains to be a big powers, just protected by Japanese natural linguistic barriers. But yeah, I think the out of economy pressures is quite right because, and that is the reasons why I mentioned about the English-speaking society, because Korea also experienced about the certain easy damage by the English medias, because in the financial societies it's very much influenced by the English medias. So if you don't appear to be transparent, they claim that this country has a wrong problems or something. And frankly speaking, I think Singapore is benefited by Korea far better than the basic structures. And also, of course, Singapore is lucky enough not to have such a huge vested interest inside their domestic market, and that is the reason why nobody claims that Singapore is suffering from untransparent kind of things. It's structurally impossible about Singapore, but other countries are not. So, and this is the time of the internet, and the internet is connected the whole world. So that easily, it's just a capital movement and internet information networks is very much integrated together. So if you just don't respond to this environment properly, in various terms, you can easily be trapped by the backlash from the globalizations. So I think you're quite right. Extra economy or extra market, I should say, structures is very crucial in the present world. So that that is something also related with my argument that the failure, the real reasons about the recent failure about Japan is that we have lost our clear we have lost the clear visions where we are standing in a global market. Still, at their surface, we are the second largest economy. Even now, we are supporting UN, we are supporting IMF, even only just after the US. So technically speaking, it's a big powers, but we are shrinking and we are not adapting well enough to the new world. So that is another extra market factor that is affecting negatively against Japan. I don't know whether I answered your question properly, but.
네, 저는 한국무역협회 국제무역연구원에서 박기임이라고 합니다. 오늘 강의 굉장히 잘 들었고요. 그 앞부분에서 말씀하신 것 중에 이미 한국이랑 일본 시장은 통합된 상태다. 근데 제가 느끼기에는 유독 그 기업 간의 협력 자체는 지금 굉장히 잘 진행이 되지 않고 있는 것 같은데요. 상대적으로 지금 굉장히 많이 보도가 되고 있는데 중국 기업이 일본 기업을 M&A 하는 사례는 상당히 많이 늘고 있는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 특히 작년에 그 중국 수냉전기가 일본 라오스를 인수한 것에서부터 해서 금년 들어서 혼마보드까지 중국 기업이 인수를 했는데요. 그 일본 자체가 사실 그 일본 기업이 갖고 있는 기업관이라고 할까요? 그게 원래 기업을 사고 팔고 한다는 그런 물적 대상으로 보는 기업관이 없다는 점과 또 중국에 대한 거부감이라고 할까요? 불안감 자체가 일본이 갖고 있는 불안감이 그 어느 나라보다도 사실 크다고 생각이 되는데 그럼에도 불구하고 이제 중국 기업에게 M&A 당하는 사례가 계속 늘고 있다는 건 분명히 뭔가의 변화가 있다고 생각이 되는데요. 그 배경이 어떤 거인지 그리고 또 그렇다면 한국 기업이 일본 기업을 M&A 하려는 그 사례는 좀 적은데요. 그 이유는 어떤 게 있는지 좀 궁금합니다.
Extreme negative feeling against the Chinese firms trying to have an M&A, trying to take over the Japanese firms, but actually there's virtually no emotional feelings against the business transactions. I mean, there's no, I should say, candlelight kind of demonstrations against China trying to take over the Japanese firms because people think that no matter, especially after the Carlos Ghosn made a CEO of Nissan automobile companies, well, people just don't pay too much attention to who is the ownership, who is the controlling managers of the companies, as long as the employment is maintained. So even the companies is taken over by Chinese firms, as long as there's no massive restructuring, massive cutting off of the jobs, well, society seems to be quite not to be too much negative about the M&A activities. And the reasons why there is very small cases of Korean firms, the reason is very clear. We belongs to the first generations of the capitalism that I explained in the speech. We have certain negative feeling about the M&A itself. And actually, even the Chinese firms, they have money, but we don't know. So far, no Chinese big M&A like taking over of the IBM PC, personal computer business, including that sort of symbolic one. They've not been so much successful yet at all. All the foreign M&A has been not really successful so far in terms of China. And in terms of Koreans in Japan, we are very close society, frankly speaking, and even though Korean firms are desperate and maybe probably leading the Japanese firms in terms of the diversity management, but still if you just really see the real decision-making process, the process is very close, very Korean society or Korean firms, so that M&A, just by using the very different people, very different managerial resources, is also all difficult for both parties. So China is, in some sense, is different from Japan and Korea generations because they adapted easily by M&A society, partly because of their history of M&As in a traditional Chinese capital ways from ancient times. And at the same time, they are very much influenced by the super globalization period, so that they learn the capitalism in 21st century, while we learn the system in 20th or maybe even 19th century. So that is why Chinese seems to be relatively easygoing about M&A, but we are sometimes quite conservative about not only accepting the M&A, but also acquiring somebody. So I think that the historical background is a crucial difference.
Okay, I think we have had a very good session this morning. I'm sure we have a very productive session, and it was very informative session. And I like to extend my deep thanks for Dr. Fukagawa for being with us this morning, and we'll expect to come back here again some other time.
Thank you very much for inviting me today.
Yes, I will close this morning session, but I couldn't resist to say this. She has been too much modest about Japanese stories and too much overstating of Koreans and other countries, a typical Japanese way of speaking, I guess. Anyway, if you agree with me, then why don't we give her another welcome applause.
Thank you very much.